Tonight, you are not here by accident. You are here because something inside you is searching for quiet, because the noise of the day has followed you into the dark, and your mind will not stop. The ancient Stoics knew this struggle. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, these were not men who theorized from comfort. They governed empires, survived betrayal, buried children, and still found stillness. Their wisdom was not written for lecture halls. It was written for nights exactly like this one. 15 lessons, 15 ways to loosen the grip of a restless mind and surrender to genuine rest. You do not need to memorize anything. You do not need to solve anything. Simply listen and let the oldest philosophy in the world walk you gently toward sleep. Stoicism was not born in a library. It was born on a street corner, in the open air, among people who had nowhere else to go. Around 300 years before the Common Era, a merchant named Zeno of Citium lost everything he owned in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. He arrived in Athens with nothing, wandered into a bookshop, and began reading about Socrates. Something in those pages grabbed him so completely that he sought out a philosopher named Crates and asked to be taught. Crates agreed. And what Zeno learned, and eventually refined into his own school of thought, was a philosophy built not around comfort, but around the question of what a human being can actually control when everything else has been taken away. He taught in a painted porch, Stoa Poikile in Greek. His students became known as the Stoics. What is remarkable is not that this philosophy survived. What is remarkable is that it found its most eloquent voices not among the sheltered or the idle, but among the broken and the burdened. Epictetus was a slave. He was born into bondage, likely somewhere in modern Turkey, and his master is said to have once twisted his leg simply to demonstrate that Epictetus felt no pain. Epictetus reportedly told him calmly that if he continued, the bone would break. The master continued. The bone broke. Epictetus said only, "Did I not tell you that it would?" He was eventually freed, expelled from Rome under an emperor who feared philosophers, and spent the rest of his life teaching in a small town in northern Greece. He never wrote a single word himself. Everything we have from him was recorded by a student named Arrian, who refused to let those conversations disappear. Marcus Aurelius sat at the opposite end of fortune. He was the most powerful man on earth, emperor of Rome, at a time when Rome was the center of the known world. And yet his private journal, the document we call the Meditations, reads not like a record of triumph, but like a man desperately trying to hold himself together. He lost children. He watched plagues sweep through his cities. He fought wars he had not chosen. He governed people who conspired against him. And each night, or morning, or quiet hour between campaigns, he wrote to himself. He argued with himself. He reminded himself of lessons he kept forgetting. The Meditations were never meant to be published. They were written for no audience but the man writing them. And then there was Seneca, a Roman senator, playwright, and advisor to the Emperor Nero, a man who accumulated enormous wealth while writing extensively about the dangers of wealth. He was not a figure without contradiction. But his letters, written in the final years of his life, carry an urgency that feels completely modern. He was writing against time, knowing it. He wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." He wrote, "It is not that I am brave enough to face danger. It is that I have finally understood what is actually dangerous." He was eventually ordered by Nero to take his own life. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, he died slowly, with more patience than fear, dictating thoughts to his scribes until the very end. These three men, a former slave, a philosopher emperor, and a condemned senator, are the voices that will carry you through this night. not because their lives were easy, but because they were not, because the philosophy they practiced was not designed for calm waters. It was designed for exactly the kind of chaos that prevents you from sleeping. Here is what you need to understand about what Stoicism actually teaches, stripped of any academic ornamentation. The Stoics believed that the universe operates according to a rational order they called the logos, a kind of deep intelligence threading through all things. They believed that human beings, alone among creatures, share in that rationality, and they believed that the only genuine good, the only thing worth protecting at all costs, is the quality of your own character and the quality of your own reasoning. Everything else, wealth, reputation, health, even the opinions of people you love, they classified as preferred indifference. Useful, sometimes deeply valuable, but not the foundation of your peace, because anything that can be taken from you is not truly yours. This is the idea that made Epictetus dangerous enough to expel and Seneca too uncomfortable to keep alive. Because the moment a person genuinely believes that their peace does not depend on external conditions, no authority on earth holds complete power over them anymore. And here is why this matters to you, tonight, in the dark, with a mind that will not stop. The reason your thoughts race when the room goes quiet is not a personal failing. It is the result of a day spent almost entirely in reactive mode, responding to what others needed, to what the world demanded, to what the clock required, never once pausing to ask what you actually chose. The philosopher and psychologist William James, centuries after the Stoics, would describe the human tendency to confuse the stream of consciousness for the self. We become our thoughts, he said, rather than the observer of them. The Stoics had a name for this condition. They called it living contrary to nature, meaning living as though external events determined your internal state, when in fact the relationship can run the other way. Every lesson tonight is an invitation to reverse that relationship, even temporarily, even just long enough to sleep. The first lesson begins where Stoicism always begins, with the distinction between what is yours and what is not. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion, his handbook of practice, with a single sentence that he considered the foundation of everything else. Some things are up to us. Some things are not. What is up to us are our judgments, our impulses, our desires, and our refusals. What is not up to us is our body, our reputation, our property, our public office, and in a word, everything that is not our own activity. He was not being abstract. He was describing the interior architecture of a night like this one, because what keeps you awake is almost always something in the second category, something that is not, in Epictetus's framework, genuinely yours to hold. A conversation that went wrong, an outcome that is not yet decided, a person whose choices you cannot control, a future that has not arrived and may not arrive in the form you fear. The Stoic practice is not to dismiss those concerns. It is to locate them correctly, to hold them at arm's length and ask with honesty, is this in my power, or is it not? If it is in your power, then worrying changes nothing. Acting does. If it is not in your power, then worrying is simply the mind consuming itself. Marcus Aurelius returned to this distinction so many times in his journal that scholars have noted it appears in almost every book of the Meditations. He was not a man who mastered this idea and moved on. He was a man who had to keep learning it over and over, because the demands of his life kept dragging him back toward the illusion of control. You are not alone in that struggle. Neither was the Emperor of Rome. What makes this lesson particularly useful at night is the specific quality of darkness. In the light of day, there is always something to do, something to fix, someone to call. Action creates the feeling of control even where no real control exists. But at night the options narrow. The phone can ring, but the call you need to make cannot happen until morning. The problem exists, but the solution, if there is one, lives in tomorrow. And so the mind, deprived of its usual tools, begins to spin. It replays. It rehearses. It catastrophizes. It generates scenarios that cannot be tested until daylight makes them testable. The Stoic response to this is not to force calm. It is to do something more radical, to actually accept that the spinning is happening, name the category of the concern, and relinquish the part that was never yours to begin with. This is not passive surrender. It is a precise act of mental housekeeping. Seneca described it in a letter to his friend Lucilius with a metaphor that has stayed with readers for nearly 2,000 years. He said that we are like men swimming in a river, exhausting ourselves fighting the current, when the only wise thing to do is to use the current, not to be carried wherever it wishes, but to move with it where possible, and reserve our energy for the moments when steering actually matters. The swimmer who fights every inch of current arrives at the bank trembling and spent. The swimmer who learns when to yield and when to push arrives not only alive, but capable of continuing. Tonight you are not being asked to solve anything. You are not being asked to forgive anyone, make any decision, or achieve any resolution. You are only being asked to begin noticing which of your nighttime thoughts belong to the category of things in your power, and which belong to the current. That noticing, the Stoics believed, is where freedom begins, not when everything is resolved, not when the circumstances change, not when the difficult person in your life finally becomes easier. The freedom begins the moment you look at an anxious thought and recognize it honestly for what it is, a judgment, not a fact, an interpretation, not a verdict, a habit of mind that can be questioned. And somewhere in that quiet questioning, the body begins to release what the day wound tight. But here is where most people stop. They hear the distinction between what is in their power and what is not. They find it reasonable, perhaps even comforting in the abstract. And then the next thought arrives, and it is a big one, and the framework collapses completely. Because knowing a principle and living inside it when the pressure is real are two entirely different skills. The Stoics understood this better than anyone, which is why they did not simply teach the dichotomy of control as an idea. They built an entire training practice around it, because the gap between understanding something and embodying it is exactly where most human suffering lives. Epictetus used a word for this training that tends to get lost in translation. He called it ascesis, the same root word that gives us asceticism, but stripped of its religious connotation. For Epictetus, ascesis simply meant practice, deliberate, repeated, uncomfortable practice, not punishment, not deprivation for its own sake. Practice in the athletic sense, the way a musician practices scales not because scales are music, but because scales build the muscle that makes music possible. He compared the Stoic student to a wrestler. You do not learn to wrestle by studying wrestling, you learn by getting on the mat. And you get thrown. And you stand up. And you get thrown again. And somewhere in all that falling, something in you becomes harder to knock over. This matters tonight, because the restless mind is not a philosophical problem. It is a physical one. The thoughts that chase you into the dark have weight. They produce cortisol. They tighten the muscles in your jaw and your shoulders. They elevate your heart rate by fractions that accumulate into hours of lost sleep. The body does not distinguish between a real threat and an imagined one. It responds to the vividness of the thought, not to its actual danger. This is why Marcus Aurelius, who understood the physiology of emotion better than most ancient thinkers, kept returning in his journal to one specific practice before sleep, the evening review. He did not call it that, but scholars of the Meditations have identified the pattern. At the end of a difficult day, he would sit with what had happened, not to punish himself for his failures, but to examine them honestly and then deliberately release them. He would ask, "What did I do today that was contrary to reason? Where did I act from impulse rather than from judgment? Where did I allow something outside my control to determine my response?" And then, crucially, having named those moments, he would set them down, not carry them into sleep, not rehearse them until they felt permanent. There is a practical reason the Stoics insisted on this nightly examination that goes beyond philosophy. They believed the mind, left unsupervised, defaults to the worst available interpretation of events, not out of pessimism, but out of evolutionary habit. The part of you that scans for danger was designed to keep you alive in environments far more immediately lethal than the ones most of us navigate today. But it does not know that. It is still running the same threat detection software that served your ancestors on the open plain, and at night, when external input drops away, that system gets louder rather than quieter. The evening review is, in effect, a manual override. You are stepping in front of that system and saying, "I will evaluate this," not you. Seneca wrote to Lucilius about this practice with a specificity that is striking even now. He said he reviewed each day in 3 passes. First, what did I do that was wrong? Second, what did I do that could have been better? Third, what did I do well that I should remember? That third pass is important because the Stoic practice is so often described as austere, as an exercise in renunciation, when in fact it was also an exercise in honest accounting. You cannot build a stable character if you only catalog your failures. You have to acknowledge your competence as well, not from vanity, but from accuracy. A ledger that only records deficits is not honest. It is distorted in a direction that guarantees despair, and this is where the practice begins to reveal something unexpected. Most of us walk into sleep carrying a version of the day that has been edited by emotion. The sharp moments got sharper. The small kindnesses dissolved. The mistake that took 3 seconds to make somehow expanded to fill the entire afternoon. Seneca's 3-pass review does something structurally corrective to that distortion. It forces equal attention onto all 3 categories, not just the one the anxious mind prefers. And when you do that consistently, something shifts in the way you evaluate your own days. The days stop being verdicts. They start being data. But there was a second practice the Stoics used at night that is even more counterintuitive, and it is the one that tends to stop people cold when they first encounter it. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Before sleep, they would deliberately imagine the things they feared might go wrong, not to induce terror, but to drain it. The logic was precise. An unexpected loss hits differently than one you have already rehearsed in your mind. The mind that has genuinely sat with the possibility of a difficult outcome is not caught entirely off guard when that outcome arrives. And crucially, the mind that has imagined the loss and found that it can survive the imagining becomes measurably less afraid of the thing it was imagining. Marcus Aurelius practiced this relentlessly. He would remind himself that the people he loved were mortal. He would note in his journal that the powerful men around him had all eventually died, some famous, some forgotten, all gone. He wrote, "Think not of the men who are still alive, but of those who have already passed." This was not morbid for him. It was calibrating. The Roman Stoics had a phrase, memento mori, remember that you will die. That has been so thoroughly commercialized in modern culture that its actual function is almost unrecognizable. It was not meant to paralyze, it was meant to restore proportion, to remind a mind inflated by the urgency of today that urgency is a sensation, not a fact, and that most of what feels catastrophic at 11 at night will feel considerably smaller in the morning light. And here is where something remarkable happens in the Stoic framework, something that does not reveal itself until you have been with these ideas long enough to feel their weight. The practices of the evening review, the premeditation of difficult futures, the honest inventory of what was and was not in your control today, none of them are designed to make you feel better in the immediate sense. They are designed to make you more honest. And honesty, the Stoics maintained, is the only soil in which genuine peace can grow. False comfort is not rest. It is postponement. The mind that tells itself everything is fine when everything is not fine does not sleep. It waits. It stays alert for the contradiction between the story it is telling and the reality it suspects. But the mind that has looked clearly at what is actually happening, named it without flinching, sorted it into what can be changed and what cannot, and then genuinely set down the second category, that mind can rest. Not because the problems are solved. Because the mind has stopped demanding that it solve them tonight. This is the first turning point in the Stoic approach to sleep, and it is subtle enough that you can miss it if you are not paying attention. The goal is not to empty your mind, it is to stop fighting your mind. The anxious thought is not the enemy. Resistance to the anxious thought is the enemy. Every time you tell yourself you should not be thinking about this, you guarantee that you will keep thinking about it. Every time you label an intrusive thought as a failure of willpower, you add a second problem on top of the first. The Stoics understood that the mind under pressure is going to generate difficult content. That is its function. The practice is not to stop the generation. The practice is to change your relationship to what is generated. Epictetus said it plainly. He said that we cannot choose our first thoughts. We can choose our second. That small gap between the thought that arrives uninvited and the response you choose to make is the entire field on which Stoic philosophy operates. And what the lessons ahead are going to explore is how to widen that gap. Not through force, through something far more interesting, because it turns out the Stoics had a third practice, one that neither Seneca nor Marcus Aurelius invented, but that both of them returned to again and again in the most difficult passages of their lives. A practice that works directly against the mechanism by which nighttime anxiety feeds itself. And the name they gave it is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the entire history of philosophy. The concept is called sympathia, and when the Stoics wrote about it, they were not being mystical. They were being precise, in a way that takes a moment to fully land. Sympathia was their word for the interconnectedness of all things within the rational order of the universe. The idea that nothing exists in isolation, that every event, every person, every thought, every night of sleeplessness is part of a web so vast and so intricate that the individual human mind can only ever perceive a tiny fragment of it. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea more than almost any other in the Meditations. He wrote, "Constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and reflect how all things have reference to one perception, the perception of this one living being." He was not asking his reader to accept a religion. He was offering a perceptual shift, a change in the angle from which you look at your own situation, because the mechanism by which nighttime anxiety operates is fundamentally one of false isolation. When you lie in the dark turning a problem over and over, the implicit assumption underneath every revolution of that thought is that this problem is yours alone, that the weight of it falls entirely on you, that the outcome depends entirely on what you do or fail to do, that you are the center of a catastrophe in progress. And sympathia is the Stoic corrective to that illusion, not by telling you your problem does not matter, but by restoring your sense of scale. Marcus Aurelius did this deliberately. He would pull his perspective back, in his writing, until the thing that was troubling him looked the size it actually was against the backdrop of time and cosmos. He wrote about looking down at the earth from above, as if from the stars, and seeing the smallness of human kingdoms, the brevity of human lives, the narrowness of the conflicts that felt so total from inside them. He was not dismissing the pain, he was contextualizing it. And contextualization, it turns out, has a measurable effect on the nervous system that modern neuroscience has begun to confirm, though the Stoics arrived at the same conclusion through pure observation roughly 2,000 years earlier. When the mind perceives itself as isolated and overwhelmed, the stress response escalates. When the mind perceives itself as part of something larger, even something it cannot fully see or understand, that escalation diminishes. Not because the problem changed, because the frame around the problem changed. The Stoics called this the view from above, and they practiced it not as escapism, but as medicine. But sympathia contained a second implication that is even more practically useful for what happens in the hours between midnight and morning. If everything is connected within a rational order, then nothing that arrives in your life, however disruptive, however painful, however inexplicable, arrives from outside that order. It arrives within it, which means that even the intrusive thought at 2 a.m, even the fear that has no clean name, even the grief that reopens without warning, is not a malfunction. It is part of the system. It belongs. And something that belongs can be received differently than something that has invaded. This is the shift that takes the Stoic framework from interesting philosophy into something that actually changes a night. Not the intellectual understanding of it, the practiced, bodily sense of it. Epictetus taught this in a way that was deliberately difficult for his students to accept. He would tell them that when something painful arrived, the first job was not to make it stop. The first job was to call it by its right name. If your child is sick, he said, do not say this is terrible. Say, my child is sick. And that is what is happening right now. Not because the situation is not serious, but because the word terrible adds something to the situation that does not help the child and does not help you. It adds a judgment, and the judgment creates suffering on top of the already difficult fact. The difficult fact you can work with. The judgment about the difficult fact is an additional weight you are carrying by choice. Now, you might push back here. You might say that calling something terrible is just honest, that some things are, by any reasonable standard, genuinely terrible, and to refuse that word seems like a kind of emotional dishonesty. Epictetus anticipated this objection. He did not say deny your feelings. He said observe the difference between the event and your story about the event. Both are real. Both matter. But they are not the same thing, and conflating them costs you something you cannot afford to lose at night, which is the ability to let the event be what it is, without dragging the whole weight of the story into sleep beside you. Seneca made the same argument from a slightly different angle. He wrote that most of what we suffer in advance. We rehearse disasters that do not come. We live through losses that have not yet happened. We argue with people in our heads who are asleep and entirely unaware of the argument. He said, and this is one of his most precise observations, that he had known many terrible things in his life, most of which never actually occurred. The suffering was real. The cause of it was imaginary, and the mechanism that produced it was imagination running without supervision. This is why the Stoic practice of naming thoughts as thoughts rather than facts is so specifically powerful as a sleep intervention. The thought, "I am going to fail at this," is not a prediction. It is a sentence. The thought, "That person does not respect me," is not a verdict. It is an interpretation. The thought, "Tomorrow is going to be worse than today," is not a forecast. It is a mood. And every one of those thoughts, when left unnamed, feels like reality. But the moment you hold it at a small distance, just enough distance to ask, "Is this a fact, or is this a judgment?" something very specific happens in the body. The cortisol begins to fall. The jaw unclenches. The breath, which you did not realize had been held, releases. Marcus Aurelius had a practice he described in the Meditations that modern philosophers call objective representation. When something disturbed him, he would strip it of all the language he would normally use to describe it. Not "this man has humiliated me," but "this man has spoken certain words in a certain order, and those words have produced a certain sensation in my body. Not my plans have been ruined, but the sequence of events I anticipated has changed, and now there is a different sequence to navigate. It sounds cold. It is not cold. It is surgical. It removes the automatic amplification that emotion applies to raw experience, and it lets you see the actual situation, which is almost always more manageable than the emotionally amplified version of it. He was not trying to become a machine. He was trying to stop being a prisoner. And here is where the Stoic lessons for nighttime rest arrive at something genuinely surprising, something that most people who encounter Stoicism on the surface completely miss. The philosophy is not asking you to feel less. It is asking you to feel with more accuracy. Zeno's original insight, passed through generations of teachers and students, refined by Epictetus in a small town in Greece after being expelled from Rome, elaborated by Marcus Aurelius in the margins of military campaigns, honed by Seneca in the last letters he wrote, knowing they might be his last. That original insight was not that emotions are weakness. It was that emotions built on false premises are a form of self-imposed suffering. The grief that is proportionate to an actual loss is not something to suppress, it is something to move through. But the grief that is not proportionate, the anxiety that is not calibrated to the actual level of threat, the anger that is responding to a story rather than a fact, that is where the practice intervenes. The distinction matters enormously tonight, because the invitation is not to feel nothing as you try to sleep. It is to notice what you are actually feeling, and then ask, gently, with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, is this feeling proportionate to what is actually happening? Or has the darkness and the quiet given it room to grow larger than its actual size? Because the mind at rest is not empty. The mind at rest is honest. And this introduces a fourth Stoic practice that takes everything established so far and presses it deeper. A practice that Epictetus described not as a philosophical position, but as a daily discipline, one so specific and so counterintuitive that when he first described it to his students, several of them reportedly could not believe it would work. He called it the discipline of assent, the deliberate practice of pausing between stimulus and response, of catching the first impression before it hardens into conviction, of staying in the space between what happens and what you decide it means for just long enough to make a genuine choice. He said this: never be in a hurry about anything. When an impression arrives, do not simply say yes. Hold it at the threshold, examine it before you let it in, because once you let it in fully, once you say yes, this is real, this is how things are, this is what it means, the impression becomes a belief. And beliefs are much harder to question than impressions. They have furniture in them. They feel like home. The discipline of assent is not about becoming slow or hesitant in practical action. It is about catching the automatic narrative machine that runs in the background of your mind, especially in the dark, especially in silence, especially when no external input is available to correct its tendency toward catastrophe. And it begins with a single habit, one so simple it feels too small to matter, until you try it and discover that it is, in fact, exactly the right size. Before you accept any nighttime thought as a report about reality, you pause, not for long. A breath, maybe two, long enough to ask, is this a fact? Or is this a fear wearing the clothes of a fact? The answer will not always be immediately clear, and that uncertainty, the Stoics would tell you, is not a problem. It is the beginning of wisdom. Because the mind that can tolerate not knowing the answer immediately is a mind that does not need to resolve everything tonight. And somewhere in that tolerance, something begins to change. Something deeper than thought, something in the body itself, begins to recognize that the emergency it has been preparing for may not be coming after all. There is something the ancient sources do not tell you directly, but that becomes unmistakable when you read them carefully enough. The Stoic philosophers were not calm people. They were people who had learned, through sustained effort and repeated failure, to act from a place of relative calm. The distinction is everything. Because calmness as a natural disposition is a gift some people receive, and most do not. But calmness as a trained response is available to anyone willing to do the work. And the work, as Epictetus never tired of pointing out, is specifically unglamorous. It does not announce itself. It does not produce visible results on any given day. It accumulates the way interest accumulates, invisibly, until one day the balance is sufficient to cover a cost that would previously have broken you. What complicates this picture, what makes it more honest and more useful, is that the Stoics themselves documented their failures at length. Marcus Aurelius did not write the Meditations from a position of having achieved Stoic mastery. He wrote them from a position of struggling toward it. He wrote, "I have not yet attained the character of a philosopher," and he wrote it not once but across multiple books. He wrote, "On this day I was irritable." He wrote, "I acted from self-interest when I knew better." He wrote about the desire to sleep longer than was good for him, about the temptation to take credit for things that went well and to blame circumstance for things that did not. He was recording the gap between the philosophy he believed in and the life he was actually living. And that record is, in its honesty, far more useful than any portrait of serene perfection would have been. Because if Marcus Aurelius, with all the resources of an empire, with years of study under Stoic teachers, with the specific motivation of knowing that the fate of millions depended on the quality of his judgment, if he still had to remind himself daily of the basic principles, then the person lying awake tonight has every reason to be patient with themselves. This is the complication that the surface reading of Stoicism tends to miss. The philosophy is demanding. It asks a great deal. But it does not ask for perfection. It asks for practice. And practice, by definition, includes failure. The Stoics had a specific term for the person who was genuinely working on this but had not yet arrived, the prokoptos, the one who is making progress. Not the sage, the idealized figure of complete philosophical attainment that the Stoics theorized about but rarely claimed to have met in person. Not the beginner, paralyzed by how much there is to learn. The one making progress. Imperfect, sometimes inconsistent, occasionally sliding backward, but oriented in the right direction and willing to continue. The prokoptos is the figure you actually are tonight, not the sage who has solved everything, not the beginner who has not started, the one making progress, lying in the dark with a restless mind, listening to ancient wisdom not because it will instantly transform you, but because transformation accumulates in exactly these moments, in the willingness to stay with the lesson rather than turn away. And what the lesson now requires is a deeper examination of desire, specifically the Stoic understanding of what desire does to sleep. The Stoics divided the causes of human suffering into two primary categories: distress arising from what we fear losing or having taken from us, and distress arising from what we want and cannot immediately obtain. The first category we have already begun to address through the practices of the evening review, the premeditation of difficult outcomes, and the discipline of assent. But the second category, the distress of unsatisfied desire, is its own territory, and it operates by its own particular mechanism in the nighttime hours. Here is how it works. The desire for something you do not have creates an implicit condition in your mind, an if-then structure. If I get this thing, then I will feel complete. If this situation resolves the way I want it to, then I will be able to rest. If this person says or does the specific thing I need them to say or do, then I will feel safe. And the problem with that structure at night is that none of those conditions can be met between midnight and morning. The thing you desire is outside your reach until the sun comes up, at minimum, and often much longer than that. So the if-then loop runs without resolution. The mind circles the unsatisfied condition again and again, not because it is broken, but because it is doing precisely what minds do when they encounter an open problem. They keep returning to it, looking for the solution they have not yet found. Epictetus had a name for this condition. He called it frustrated desire, and he considered it the primary source of human unhappiness. Not the absence of good things, but the belief that specific good things are necessary for peace, combined with the recognition that those specific things are not currently present. The mind that needs the approval of a particular person in order to feel secure will be perpetually insecure, because approval is always conditionally given and can always be withdrawn. The mind that needs a specific outcome from a particular situation in order to feel at ease will be perpetually uneasy, because outcomes are always uncertain. The mind that needs tomorrow to go a certain way in order to rest tonight will not rest tonight, because tomorrow has not made any promises. The Stoic solution to this is not to stop wanting things. That is neither possible nor desirable. It is to change the object of desire, to move your desire away from outcomes you cannot control, and toward the quality of your own engagement with whatever comes. To want, genuinely and completely, to respond well, rather than to have things go well. These are not the same want. One is always in your power. One almost never is. Seneca articulated this shift in a way that is worth sitting with slowly. He wrote that the wise person desires nothing that can be refused. And at first that sounds like the advice of someone who has given up, who has shrunk their aspirations to avoid disappointment. But read it again. Desires nothing that can be refused. What cannot be refused to you? Your own attention, your own honesty, your own effort, your own choice about how to interpret what is happening, your own decision about where to direct your energy. These things cannot be taken from you unless you hand them over. And when you genuinely want those things, when your desire aligns with what is actually in your power, the engine of frustrated desire goes quiet. Not because you have stopped caring about the world, but because you have stopped building your peace on ground that was never stable enough to hold it. This is where the Stoic lessons begin to intersect with something that researchers who study sleep have documented independently though the Stoics arrived at the same territory without the laboratory equipment. The physiological state required for sleep onset is incompatible with the state of wanting. Wanting activates the dopaminergic anticipation system. It produces a forward-leaning alertness, a readiness for the thing that is coming. It is the opposite of the settling, the releasing, the downward curve of attention that sleep requires. This is why you cannot fall asleep when you are excited about something wonderful happening tomorrow. The wanting keeps you awake as reliably as the fearing. The mechanism is different, but the result is the same. The Stoic practice of reorienting desire from external outcomes to internal quality is not, in other words, merely a philosophical position. It has a direct effect on the physiological preconditions of rest. When you genuinely stop needing tomorrow to go a particular way, the body has permission to settle, not because you have stopped caring about tomorrow, because you have relocated your stake in it somewhere the night can reach. But here is where the picture becomes more complicated and more honest, because the reorientation of desire that Epictetus describes is not something you can perform once and consider done. It is something that requires maintenance. It is an ongoing practice rather than a permanent achievement. And the specific way it tends to break down is subtle enough that you can fail to notice it happening until the sleeplessness has already returned. The breakdown usually looks like this. A person encounters the Stoic ideas about desire, finds them genuinely useful, practices them with some consistency, and begins to sleep better. The anxiety that was keeping them awake diminishes. The circular thinking slows. The body learns to settle. And then, gradually, the practice relaxes, not through any conscious decision, but through the ordinary drift that happens when any effort is no longer producing visible results because it is working. The practice becomes background noise, and into the resulting space, the old patterns return, not all at once. In small increments. A night of lying awake thinking about something that cannot be resolved until morning. Then, a week of them. Then, the return of the weight that had temporarily lifted. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this drift explicitly. He called it the tendency of the mind to fall back into its ruts. He used the word habituation, the philosopher's term for the way any path of thinking becomes easier the more it is traveled. The rut of anxious desire is an old road for most of us. It was carved by years of a culture that told us in every available medium that we do not yet have enough, that we are not yet enough, that what is missing is the specific obstacle between us and our peace. Undoing that rut takes more than understanding. It takes repetition in the opposite direction, which is to say, it takes exactly what you are doing right now, returning to these ideas, practicing in the quiet, rebuilding the habit of the Stoic mind on the one surface where it has the best chance of taking hold. The surface of the night, the dark and the silence where no performance is required and no one is watching, and the only question is the one that was always the most important one. What do you actually believe about what is in your power and what is not? Because the answer you carry into sleep is the answer that shapes the quality of sleep you get, and the quality of sleep you get shapes, in ways that are now documented in substantial clinical detail, the quality of every waking hour that follows, which means the Stoic question is not an abstract one. It has a direct and measurable consequence that loops through everything else you will experience tomorrow. And the Stoics knew this. They just knew it differently, without the neuroscience, through the simpler and more direct evidence of watching themselves and their students sleep better or worse depending on the state of their philosophical practice. which raises a question that none of the three great Stoic voices fully resolves, and that sits at the center of the most difficult lesson in this entire tradition. What do you do when the thing keeping you awake is not a fear or a frustrated desire, but a genuine grief? When the thing in the dark is not something you imagined, but something you actually lost? When the Stoic distinctions feel not like wisdom, but like a set of instructions written for someone whose suffering is smaller than yours? The Stoics anticipated this objection. They had to, because the people who came to study with Epictetus were not people who were merely anxious about hypothetical futures. They were people who had lost real things. Slaves who had lost their freedom. Citizens who had lost their property to Roman taxation or confiscation. Parents who had buried children in an era when childhood mortality was not a statistical abstraction, but a near-universal experience. Soldiers who had come back from campaigns that took people they loved. The philosophy was not developed in a vacuum of comfortable privilege. It was stress tested against genuine devastation, repeatedly, by the people who built it. And here is the pivot. Here is what the surface reading of Stoicism almost always gets wrong, and what getting it wrong costs you when you need the philosophy most. The Stoics did not say that grief is irrational. They did not say that loss should not hurt. They did not say that the tears of a parent over a dead child are a philosophical error. What they said is something far more precise and far more compassionate, and it requires a careful distinction that gets lost every time Stoicism is summarized too quickly. They distinguished between two types of what we might loosely call negative emotion. The first they called passions, or in Greek, path. These are the violent, overwhelming emotional responses that are built on false judgments about reality. The excessive grief that convinces you that your life is over because you have lost something. The rage that tells you another person's action has destroyed you. The terror that insists you cannot survive a difficulty you have not yet encountered. These, the Stoics argued, are built on mistakes, not on the underlying loss or the underlying danger, but on the judgment that the loss or the danger is more significant than it is, that it reaches into territory it does not actually reach, that it invalidates something about you or your capacity to continue that it does not actually invalidate. But the second category, the one that is almost always omitted in popular accounts of Stoicism, they called opathei, the good emotions, and among these they listed lupa, which is sometimes translated as rational grief. Not the grief that tells you that you are destroyed, but the grief that recognizes with complete honesty that something real and valuable is gone. The Stoics did not consider this grief to be a weakness or an error. They considered it to be the appropriate response of a rational being who understood what they had lost. Marcus Aurelius grieved his children. He said so. Epictetus spoke of loss with a directness that is emotionally raw even across the distance of centuries. Seneca wrote letters about the death of friends that are among the most moving documents in ancient literature. What they refused was not the grief itself. What they refused was the judgment layered on top of the grief that said, "Because this is gone, everything is gone. Because this person is gone, my capacity for meaning is gone. Because this future I had imagined is gone, any future worth living is gone." That is the distinction that changes everything. And it changes the question that was just asked, the one about what to do when the thing in the dark is genuine loss. Because the Stoic answer is not, reason your way out of it. The Stoic answer is, grieve with accuracy. Let the grief be the size of what was actually lost, without letting the fear and the story around the grief expand it into something that devours everything else. Feel the loss fully. Name it honestly. Sit with it in the dark without immediately trying to fix it, or transcend it, or convert it into a lesson. And then, when the feeling has been given its honest space, bring the discipline of assent to the layer of interpretation sitting on top of it, not to the grief itself, but to the conclusions the grief is trying to draw about what is still possible, what is still true, what you still have. This is a harder practice than everything discussed so far. It requires you to hold two things simultaneously: the genuine reality of the pain, and the honest assessment of what the pain actually means and does not mean. Neither one cancels the other. The grief is real, and the story that the grief is telling you about your future may not be. Seneca wrote to a friend named Lucilius, who had recently lost someone he loved and could not stop thinking about the loss at night. He did not tell Lucilius to stop grieving. He told him to continue grieving as long as the grief was honest. He said that there is a natural span to grief, and that this span should be honored. But he also said, gently and without judgment, that when grief outlives its honest span, when it becomes a habit rather than a response, when the mind clings to it not because it is still necessary, but because the mind has made it part of its identity, then the grief has shifted into something the Stoics would classify differently, not as an appropriate response to loss, but as a refusal to re-engage with the life that remains. This distinction recontextualizes every practice described so far in a way that significantly increases the stakes. Because if the only thing keeping you awake were fear and frustrated desire, the practices are demanding, but navigable. Name the thoughts as thoughts. Locate them in the dichotomy of control. Retrain the object of desire toward what is genuinely in your power. But grief does not respond to those practices in the same way, because grief is not a mistake. Grief is a recognition, and recognition cannot be argued out of existence. It can only be accompanied, and eventually, when the timing is right, expanded. The expansion Seneca describes is not the replacement of grief with cheerfulness. It is the slow restoration of perspective, the gradual re-entry into the awareness that the person who grieves still exists, still has capacity, still has relationships and work and days ahead that carry their own weight and their own dignity. He told Lucilius that the dead do not need our prolonged suffering. They need to be remembered. And there is a significant difference between those two things. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, went further. He wrote about the impermanence of all things in a way that sounds harsh until you understand what purpose it was serving. He would write, "This person I loved is mortal. I knew this from the beginning. The loss is painful, but it is not surprising. Not in the sense that reality has been violated. Reality has only been made explicit. And the same impermanence that took this person will eventually take everything, including the grief itself, including me. This is not callousness. This is the Stoic practice of memento mori applied to its most difficult case. Not to possessions, not to status, not to plans, but to the people we love most. And the reason the Stoics kept returning to this practice, despite its difficulty, despite the discomfort it produced, is precisely because it changes the texture of time in a way that nothing else quite does. When you genuinely carry the awareness that the people you love are mortal, you do not love them less. You love them with more attention. You grieve them less when they are still present, because you have already begun honoring the fact of their finitude while they are still here to receive it. And when they are gone, the grief, though it is no less real, sits within a framework the mind already knew was coming, which is not the same as being prepared in any comfortable sense, but is different from being entirely blindsided, which is where most people meet loss because They have never been given permission to think about it in advance. The premeditation of evils, which was introduced earlier as a practice for managing anxiety about hypothetical futures, turns out to be the same practice applied to this much harder territory. And the reason it matters for sleep specifically is this. The mind that has never allowed itself to contemplate loss tends to encounter it in the dark, repeatedly, as a shock. The mind that has practiced sitting with the reality of impermanence, even imperfectly, even reluctantly, encounters it in the dark as something familiar, not welcome, necessarily, not painless, but familiar. And familiarity, at 3 a.m, is the difference between a thought that spirals and a thought that settles. But the pivot goes deeper still, because there is something in the Stoic treatment of grief that has been obscured by centuries of misreading, something that the original texts contain, but that gets filtered out when the philosophy is summarized for popular consumption. The Stoics believed in love. They believed in deep, genuine, committed attachment to other people, to work that matters to the communities we belong to. Epictetus, who is often portrayed as the coldest of the major Stoic voices, spoke of the philosopher's obligation to love other people not despite their impermanence, but precisely because of it. He said that the person who understands that everything is borrowed, that nothing is truly theirs to keep, loves with a particular quality of attention that the person who assumes permanence cannot access. Because when you know that this moment with this person is one of a finite number of such moments, you are present in it differently. You are not elsewhere in your mind. You are not taking it for granted. You are here, in it, with the full weight of your attention. And this is the recontextualization that changes the entire framework of what the Stoic lessons for nighttime rest are actually about. They are not about detachment. They never were. They are about the quality of attachment, the difference between the love that grasps and the love that appreciates. The difference between the desire that demands a specific outcome and the desire that fully engages with what is actually present. The difference between the mind that cannot sleep because it is trying to hold everything in place, and the mind that can sleep because it has genuinely received what today offered, honored what today cost, and released what it cannot carry into tomorrow. The stakes are not merely philosophical. The stakes are the texture of your entire life. Every relationship you have is being shaped, right now, by whether you are capable of this quality of presence. Every day is being measured not only by what it contained, but by how much of it you actually allowed yourself to receive. And the reason this is the hardest Stoic lesson, the one that sits at the center of everything else, is that it requires you to stop holding on. Not to stop caring, not to stop wanting, but to stop holding on to the outcome of the caring, to stop clenching around the wanting, to stop treating love as a guarantee rather than as a practice, which means that the restless mind at night, the mind that will not stop, is not always failing at peace. Sometimes it is failing at something more fundamental. Sometimes it is failing at trust. Trust is a word that gets handled carelessly. It is used to describe the belief that a person will keep a promise, or that a bridge will hold weight, or that a medication will do what the label says. But the trust the Stoics were pointing toward is of a different order entirely, and understanding what it actually means in their framework is what separates the philosophy from the dozens of productivity systems and wellness practices that borrow its language without inheriting its depth. The trust the Stoics practiced was not trust in other people. It was not trust in institutions, or in the goodwill of the powerful, or in the reliability of favorable outcomes. All of those things, as every Stoic thinker had learned through personal experience, can fail and will fail, and, failing to account for that possibility, is the beginning of a particular kind of suffering that is both avoidable and surprisingly common. The trust they practiced was trust in the rational order of things, in the logos, the deep structure of cause and effect and consequence that runs through all events, visible and invisible. And the reason this matters for a restless mind at night is specific and practical. The mind that trusts in that order does not need to supervise everything. The mind that trusts in that order can set down the day's unresolved business and sleep, not because the business will resolve itself without effort, but because the mind that is exhausted from failing to sleep is not the mind that will resolve it well in the morning. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this in terms that are unusually direct for a philosopher usually measured in his self-disclosure. He said that the part of him that could not stop reviewing decisions, second-guessing choices, rehearsing arguments, was not the part of him that governed well. It was the part that needed to be governed. He described the practice of sleep as itself a philosophical act, a willing submission to the fact that consciousness does not need to be maintained at all times in order for the world to continue functioning, that the universe does not require your wakefulness to proceed, and that the part of you insisting otherwise is not wisdom. It is the ego misidentifying its own importance. This is the first direct consequence of the pivot. The realization that the restless mind is not working harder than the rested mind. It is working less effectively, while costing more. Every hour of lost sleep that is spent in anxious review produces not solutions, but a fatigued, cortisol-saturated nervous system that will face the next day's actual problems with diminished capacity for exactly the kind of clear judgment that the Stoics considered the highest human function. The mind that cannot trust the night is not protecting itself. It is eroding itself, and eroding itself in a way that compounds over days and weeks and months into a diminishment of the very rational capacity that the Stoic tradition considers the defining gift of human nature. Seneca saw this clearly, perhaps more clearly than anyone in the tradition, because he was constitutionally someone who did not sleep easily. He wrote about his own sleeplessness with a candor that is almost modern in its texture. He described lying awake, turning thoughts over, not because they were productive thoughts, but because the thinking had become a habit that the mind returned to automatically, the way the tongue returns to a sore tooth. He did not pathologize himself for this. But he also did not romanticize it. He called it what it was, a failure to exercise the discipline he was teaching. And he kept writing about it, because he understood that the gap between knowing a principle and living it is not a gap you cross once. It is a gap you cross repeatedly, every night, sometimes more successfully than others. What Seneca did with his own sleeplessness is instructive. He did not fight it directly. He had learned, as anyone who has genuinely struggled with this learns eventually, that fighting insomnia directly is almost always counterproductive. The effort to force sleep activates the same alerting systems that prevent it. Trying harder does not work. But redirecting the mind's activity into something that gradually loses the quality of urgency, something that requires attention but not agitation, something that draws the focus inward and downward rather than outward and forward, this is where the Stoic practices become, in very practical terms, a sleep technology. He would read. Specifically, he would read the Stoics, not to acquire new information, but to inhabit a quality of thinking that was different from the quality his anxious mind produced on its own. He wrote to Lucilius that the purpose of reading philosophy before sleep was not comprehension, but companionship. The text became a voice in the room, a calm voice, a voice that had already thought through the things he was worried about and arrived somewhere useful. And in the company of that voice, his own thinking would gradually settle into a different register, This practice of using philosophical reading as a transition ritual before sleep is one of the specific behavioral recommendations embedded in the Stoic tradition, and it survives in a fragmented form in the advice of sleep researchers who recommend reading over screen time in the final hour before bed, without necessarily knowing that Seneca was recommending the same thing in the 1st century of the Common Era. But the practice goes further than passive reading, because the Stoics also recommended writing, specifically writing in the meditation style that Marcus Aurelius made famous. The practice of addressing yourself on the page with honesty and some directness, of working through what happened today, not in your head, where the thoughts loop and compound, but on paper or its equivalent, where they become fixed, visible, and therefore manageable. The act of writing a thought externalizes it. It moves it from the interior, where it can recombine endlessly with other thoughts, to a surface where it has boundaries. It begins and it ends. You can look at it from outside. You can see its actual size. This is the counter-move that changes the direction of the conflict that the restless mind has with the night. Not a philosophical position, not a belief, a practice. Something done with the hands, in the specific quiet of the hour before sleep, that changes the state of the mind that will eventually attempt sleep. The Stoics were not, ultimately, theorists. They were, as Epictetus insisted repeatedly, practitioners, and the practice they recommended at the threshold of sleep was this: write what is in your head. All of it. Without editing, without presenting it favorably, without softening the worst of it. Get it out of the interior and onto a surface. Then apply the 3 questions. What here is in my power? What here is not? What did I do today that I would do differently? And then close the record. Not as a defeat, not as a performance of acceptance, but as a genuine decision that tonight's account is complete. That what was in the head has been acknowledged and placed somewhere outside the head, and that the head is therefore now, in the most literal sense, available. The stakes of this practice are higher than they might appear, because the decision to close the record, to genuinely stop the review for the night, is not a passive thing. It is an act of will. And it is an act of will that the Stoics considered one of the most significant a person could perform, because it requires the kind of trust that was introduced at the close of Part 6. Trust that the matters not yet resolved can remain unresolved until morning without disaster. Trust that you do not have to be awake for reality to continue. Trust that the intelligence that runs through all things does not require your conscious supervision to proceed. Marcus Aurelius described this trust in terms that are worth sitting with slowly. He wrote that nature, by which he meant the rational order of the cosmos, does not demand that you understand it fully in order to participate in it correctly. A plant does not understand photosynthesis. It simply grows toward the light. A river does not understand hydrology. It simply runs downhill. And a human being does not need to resolve every open question before sleep in order to live and act and contribute in the morning with full integrity. The requirement is not resolution. The requirement is engagement, showing up tomorrow with enough rest to engage well. There is a tension here that the Stoics acknowledged honestly, because the same tradition that tells you to close the record also insists on the importance of virtue, of character, of taking your responsibilities seriously. And it can feel as though closing the record, as though stopping the review before everything is settled, is a failure of that seriousness, as though the person who worries all night is somehow more committed than the person who sleeps. The Stoics rejected this with some force. Seneca wrote, almost with exasperation, that the person who lies awake worrying is not doing their work better. They are doing their worrying instead of their work. And the two are not the same thing. Worrying is not a form of preparation. It is a form of suffering that convinces itself it is preparation. The preparation is the evening review. The worrying is what happens when the evening review is skipped, and the mind, denied a structured outlet for its concerns, generates its own unstructured and typically much less useful version. This distinction matters not just for the individual night, but for the pattern that accumulates across a life. Epictetus pointed to the way habits of mind compound over time, in much the same way that habits of behavior do. The person who spends 20 years lying awake, reviewing and catastrophizing, and second-guessing has, over those 20 years, trained their mind in a very specific direction. They have made the rut of anxious nighttime review deeper and more automatic with each repetition. And the consequence of that training is not just lost sleep. It is a mind that has become increasingly skilled at finding reasons to be alarmed and increasingly unskilled at the kind of calm, sustained attention that Stoic philosophy considers the foundation of a life well lived. But here is where the picture shifts again, where the counter-move introduces its own complication. The Stoic practices for sleep, the evening review, the premeditation of difficult outcomes, the closing of the record, the redirection of desire toward what is genuinely in your power, all of them work. There is enough evidence in the texts, enough corroboration in the lives of the people who practice them, to say with confidence that they work. But they do not work in the way that most people who encounter them for the first time expect them to work. And the gap between the expected mechanism and the actual mechanism is where most people abandon the practices before they have a genuine chance to take root. The expected mechanism is relief. The person learns the philosophy, applies it, and feels immediate calm. The anxiety lifts. The circular thinking stops. The body settles. This does happen occasionally in the early stages. The novelty of a new framework, the simple act of applying attention to the problem of sleeplessness rather than just suffering through it, can produce a short-term improvement that feels like the philosophy working. But then, the novelty fades, and the old patterns begin to return, and the person concludes, usually quietly, without fully articulating it, that the philosophy was a temporary fix rather than a lasting change. And they move on, looking for the next approach. What they have not understood is that this is precisely the moment the practice was designed for. The moment the philosophy stops feeling new is the moment it starts becoming real. This is not a paradox. It is the basic structure of any genuine skill development, and the Stoics understood it with a clarity that their modern interpreters sometimes lose in the enthusiasm of initial encounter. Epictetus described the stages of philosophical development with a precision that maps almost exactly onto what contemporary psychologists call the stages of skill acquisition. In the first stage, you encounter the ideas and they feel revelatory. You see your own thinking from the outside, perhaps for the first time, and the distance between the thought and the thinker opens up. There is relief in this. There is the particular pleasure of a framework that makes sense of things that previously felt chaotic. In this stage, people read widely, talk about the philosophy enthusiastically, recommend it to others, apply it selectively in situations where it comes easily. The practice feels, in this stage, like an arrival. The second stage is where most people quietly leave. The ideas are no longer new. The relief of the initial encounter has faded. The situations where the philosophy applies easily have been handled, and what remains are the situations where it does not come easily at all, where the thought that arrives in the dark is not a manageable anxiety about a minor tomorrow, but the deep, structural fear that something about your life is fundamentally wrong, where the grief that surfaces at 2 a.m. is not the kind that responds to philosophical reframing, but the kind that has roots going back years, possibly decades, to losses that were never fully processed, because there was never a quiet enough moment to process them until now. The philosophy in these situations does not feel like a tool. It feels like a map of a country you cannot find. The Stoics had a name for this stage too, though they described it functionally rather than as a developmental phase. They called it the moment of testing, and they considered it not a failure of the philosophy, but the philosophy's most essential application. Because any set of ideas that works only when things are going relatively well is not a philosophy, it is a mood. Philosophy, in the Stoic definition, is specifically what you have available when nothing else works. Epictetus told his students directly, "Do not wait for the test to arrive before you have learned the response." The time to practice the discipline of assent is not when the overwhelming thought is already in the room. The time to practice is in the ordinary moments, the small irritations, the minor disappointments, the everyday friction of a life lived among other people who have their own agendas and their own blind spots. Every small practice prepares you for the large one. Every time you catch the thought before it hardens into belief, you make it marginally easier to catch the next thought. Not because you are mechanically conditioning yourself, but because you are developing what Epictetus called prohairesis, the capacity for genuine choice, the faculty of rational will that is the most distinctly human thing you possess, and also the most easily abandoned when things get difficult. The consequences of abandoning prohairesis, of letting the test arrive without preparation, are not abstract. They have a specific texture in the night, and that texture is what most people who struggle with sleep know intimately even if they have never called it by a philosophical name. It is the quality of the thought that cannot be interrupted, the thought that builds on itself, the thought that takes a real concern and amplifies it through association until it has recruited every other worry in the vicinity and formed a coalition of anxieties that feels like evidence for a conclusion the thinking never actually established. I did not do well enough today becomes I never do well enough becomes I am the kind of person who does not do well enough becomes the people in my life will eventually realize this becomes I will lose the things, and people I value most becomes there is nothing I can do about any of this. The cascade is fast. It is specific, and it runs on the same mechanism that makes human beings excellent at complex reasoning, the capacity to connect one thought to another and follow chains of implication to their conclusions. The problem is that at night, without the corrective input of real experience, without the feedback of actual events, without the grounding presence of other people who could contradict the cascade with their actual behavior, the chain of association runs unchecked. It goes where anxiety, rather than evidence, leads it. And anxiety, left to navigate on its own, consistently leads toward the worst available interpretation of any given situation. The Stoic countermove to this cascade is not to interrupt it from outside, to introduce a calming thought that fights the anxious thought on its own terms. That approach almost always fails, because the anxious thought has the home advantage in the dark and in the silence. The countermove is structural. It changes the conditions under which the cascade can run, rather than trying to stop any individual thought within it. The structural change is this. The Stoic evening practices remove the unprocessed material before it becomes fuel. The evening review, the closing of the record, the writing that externalizes what is internal, the deliberate identification of what is and is not in your power, these do not calm the anxious mind by telling it to be calm. They calm it by reducing the inventory of unprocessed concerns that the anxious mind has available to work with. A mind that has genuinely reviewed the day, genuinely located its concerns in their correct categories, genuinely released what cannot be resolved tonight, does not have the same raw material available at 2 in the morning. There is less to work with. The cascade starts, and it finds less fuel than it expected, and it runs shorter than it would have otherwise. But here is the complication that the Stoic tradition introduces at exactly this point, the one that makes the picture deeper and more difficult than a simple prescription for nightly journaling. The practices work in proportion to the depth of the philosophical understanding behind them. Done superficially, done as a technique without the underlying conviction, done as a routine without the genuine commitment to the questions they are asking, the practices produce diminishing returns. They become, over time, another thing you are supposed to do before bed that you cannot quite keep up with. Another item on the list of things you intend to do better that you keep falling short of. Done with genuine philosophical engagement, with the actual question of what is in your power and what is not taken seriously rather than used as a formula, the practices compound in the opposite direction. They get more effective over time, not less, because the understanding behind them deepens with each application. Each evening review that is done honestly produces a slightly more accurate map of the patterns in your thinking. Each night that you genuinely close the record teaches the body a little more clearly that closing is possible. Each morning that follows a rested night provides the lived evidence that the world does not require your anxious supervision to continue, and that evidence accumulates into a counter-narrative to the one that anxiety generates, a counter-narrative built not on hope or on philosophical conviction alone, but on actual experience of what happens when the practices are followed. The Stoics called this kind of experiential confidence pistis, a form of trust rooted in evidence rather than in mere belief, and they considered it qualitatively different from the intellectual acceptance of a proposition. You can intellectually accept that the night does not require your vigilance. You can find the argument for it completely convincing, and still lie awake. But the person who has evidence, who has the actual memory of nights that rested and mornings that followed without catastrophe, who has the physical experience of what it feels like when the record is genuinely closed, that person has something that no amount of argument can produce on its own. This is why Seneca returned to the practices in his letters not just as recommendations, but as personal testimony. He was not only offering Lucilius a set of techniques. He was offering the evidence of his own experience with them, the record of what had happened in his own sleeplessness when he applied the practices honestly, and what had happened when he did not. The letters are the counter-narrative in written form. They are pistis made available to someone who has not yet accumulated it for himself, and there is a wider consequence to all of this that goes beyond the individual night, beyond any single person's relationship with sleep. The Stoic tradition understood that the quality of a person's inner life has consequences that extend outward. Marcus Aurelius was not merely a philosopher trying to sleep better. He was the administrator of an empire whose decisions affected millions of people. Seneca was not merely a private intellectual managing his anxiety. He was an advisor to one of the most consequential and unstable rulers in Roman history. Epictetus was not merely a former slave finding peace in retirement. He was training the next generation of people who would themselves be in positions of influence and responsibility. The Stoics believed, with a conviction that ran through all their work, that a person who cannot manage their own inner life cannot manage anything external with full integrity. Not because the external work requires calm, though it does, but because the person who is governed by their own passions, their own frustrated desires, their own unexamined fears, is making decisions not from reason, but from the emotion that currently has the highest volume. And decisions made from the highest volume emotion, rather than from careful rational judgment, tend to produce outcomes that compound poorly. One reactive decision creates a situation, that requires another reactive decision to manage, which creates another, and the person finds themselves, after months or years, living in a world that seems to have conspired to produce exactly the crises they feared, without ever recognizing that the crises were partly authored by the quality of the decisions that preceded them. The Stoic path out of this is not self-control in the sense of suppression. It is self-knowledge in the sense that Socrates meant when he said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Know what you are actually thinking. Know why you are thinking it. Know whether the thought is a response to reality or a projection of fear. Know what you actually have the power to change and what you are spending your energy on that you do not. And build that knowledge into the texture of each day, each evening, each night, so that it is available not just as a philosophical position, but as a practiced habit of mind. Because the stakes are larger than sleep. They always were. What happens in the dark, the quality of mind that meets the silence when the performance of the day is over and the actual contents of your thinking become audible, that is the substrate on which everything else is built. And what the Stoics knew, and what Marcus Aurelius demonstrated across 20 years of reign that was historically turbulent by any measure, is that the substrate can be cultivated. The quality of the inner life is not fixed. It is not a given. It is the result of choices made repeatedly, in the ordinary moments, in the unglamorous practice of asking the same questions again and again, even when the asking feels like repetition, especially when it does. And the hardest of those questions, the one that the tradition circles back to at every point of difficulty, is also the simplest one. What, right now, is genuinely in my power? Not what should be, not what was, not what might be tomorrow if circumstances align in a particular way. What, in this specific moment, with this specific mind, and this specific body, and this specific set of conditions, is genuinely available to me as a choice? The answer to that question, taken seriously, is almost always smaller than anxiety suggests, and larger than despair insists. It is never nothing. Even Epictetus in chains had something. Even Seneca, under sentence of death, had something. The question is not whether something is available. The question is whether you are willing to work with what is actually there, rather than with what you wish were there. And that willingness, it turns out, is itself a form of rest, what is genuinely in my power. The question has the quality of simplicity, but the more honestly you pursue it, the more it reveals about what you have been avoiding, and what most people have been avoiding when they reach far enough into the honest answer is not any particular fear about tomorrow. It is a fear that sits behind all the specific fears like a wall behind a curtain. A fear so fundamental that the mind has built an entire architecture of lesser anxieties specifically to keep itself occupied and away from the wall. The fear is this, that none of it, in the final accounting, matters enough. Not the particular fears about failing at a job or losing a relationship or making the wrong decision. Those are real, and the Stoic practices for managing them are real, and they work. But underneath those manageable fears, for many people, in the specific vulnerability of the dark and the quiet, there is something larger and less articulable, a vertigo, a sense of the life being very small against the backdrop of a very large universe that does not notice it, a suspicion which cannot be fully voiced in daylight because daylight keeps it at a safe distance, that the urgency of everything you are worrying about is itself a kind of illusion, and that behind the illusion is an emptiness that none of the Stoic techniques for managing anxiety were designed to address. The Stoics knew about this. They knew because they talked to enough people in enough distress to recognize when the surface problem was not the actual problem. and because, in their own private writing, they encountered it themselves. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it with a directness that is startling when you find it in the Meditations, a text that is usually read as a record of measured philosophical practice. He wrote, "Soon you will have forgotten everything, and soon everything will have forgotten you." He wrote, "Alexander the Great and his muleteer both died." He wrote, "The wise men and the fools, the brave and the cowardly, the eloquent and the stammering, all ended in the same place." He wrote, "In 2 or 3 generations no one will even remember your name." He was not writing this to produce despair. He was writing it because he had found, through long practice, that staring directly at the scale of human smallness and the certainty of personal extinction was not, as most people fear, the path into paralyzing nihilism. It was, paradoxically, the path toward the most solid ground available. Here is why, and this is the pivot that changes everything that has been said so far about Stoic practice. The person who cannot look at their own mortality honestly is the person who must keep the lesser fears running continuously, because the lesser fears are what keep the larger one out of view. The anxiety about tomorrow's meeting, about the relationship that might be failing, about the money that might run out, about the reputation that might suffer, all of these are real concerns and they deserve real attention. But they also serve, for most people, most of the time, as a perimeter defense. A ring of manageable fears keeping the unmanageable one at bay. And this is one of the reasons the restless mind at night cannot be quieted simply by resolving the surface anxieties. Because for every one that gets resolved, another one forms to take its place. The defense is not protecting against specific threats, it is protecting against the territory behind all of them. Marcus Aurelius's practice of sitting with impermanence, with smallness, with the specific and certain fact of his own eventual disappearance, was not an exercise in despair. It was, in the Stoic framework, the ultimate application of the dichotomy of control. Because death is the most complete example of something that is not in your power, something that will happen regardless of how carefully you plan, how virtuously you live, how diligently you practice. And the mind that has genuinely accepted this, not as an intellectual proposition, but as a lived reality that it has sat with and not run from, that mind is freed from a burden that no other philosophical technique can lift, because it has stopped defending the perimeter. When Marcus Aurelius wrote that soon everything will have forgotten him, he was not being morbid. He was doing precisely what the Stoic practice of memento mori at its deepest level is designed to do, clearing the ground, removing the weight of the belief that his significance depended on being remembered, on being successful, on being respected, on any of the preferred indifference that the Stoic tradition had always classified as secondary, not because those things do not matter in any sense, but because their mattering is conditional, temporal, dependent on the judgment of others, on the continuation of a particular social order, on the survival of records that can be lost, and anything that conditional cannot be the foundation of peace. What remains, when you have genuinely taken the full weight of impermanence onto yourself and found that you can carry it without collapsing, is something the Stoics called eupatheia in its fullest form. The calm that is not a suppression of emotion, but its proper ordering, not the absence of caring. The presence of caring that does not need a guarantee of permanence in order to be genuine. Seneca, who was writing his final letters under the awareness that Nero's patience with him was running out, produced in those letters some of the most luminous writing in the Stoic tradition. And what is striking about the late letters is their quality of unhurriedness. He was not rushing. He was not cramming in every insight before the door closed. He was writing as though he had all the time that was needed, which in the philosophical sense he did, because the time that was needed was only ever this moment. He wrote to Lucilius, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time." That phrase is never short of time. It sounds paradoxical for a man who knew he had very little of it left. But it is the logical conclusion of everything the Stoic tradition had been building toward. The person who has genuinely done the day's philosophical work, who has reviewed the record and closed it, who has located their concerns in the dichotomy of control and released what is not theirs to carry, who has grieved honestly and desired wisely and trusted the order behind the chaos, that person has nothing unfinished that the night can torment them with. They have lived the day completely. And the day lived completely is, in a meaningful sense, a life lived completely. It does not require tomorrow to be different from what it will be. It does not require the arc to bend toward justice on any particular schedule. It requires only that today was met with full engagement and full honesty, and full willingness to be exactly where one was. This is the highest stakes version of the lesson about closing the record. Not closing it because the problems are solved. Closing it because the day was complete, whether or not the problems were solved. Because your engagement with it was real, whether or not the outcomes matched your wishes. Because you were present. And being present, fully present, is the thing that can never be taken back once it has been given. Epictetus, who had been taken from his family as a child, who had been owned by another person for years of his life, who had had his body used as a demonstration that pain can be inflicted without producing submission, Epictetus said that freedom is not the absence of constraint. Freedom is the condition of a mind that has located its sovereignty correctly. And the sovereignty of the mind, located correctly, is never in what happens to the body, or to the plans, or to the relationships, or to the projects. It is always in the quality of the engagement with whatever is currently true. He told his students that a man in chains who has understood the Stoic lesson is freer than an emperor who has not. This was not a metaphor for him. It was biographical. He had been the man in chains. And he was also the person who had worked out, from that specific position, the only philosophy that could possibly be adequate to it. Now the stakes are fully visible, and they are as large as any stakes get. This is not a philosophy for managing minor inconveniences, or for optimizing productivity, or for sleeping slightly better on nights when the anxiety is at a manageable level. This is a philosophy for meeting the actual human condition, the condition of a being who knows it will die, who cannot control most of what happens to it, who loves things that will be lost, who plans futures that will not arrive as planned, who builds identities that will be dismantled by time, and who must somehow find, within all of that, a way to engage fully and honestly, and without despair. The Stoics found it. Not perfectly, not without struggle, not without the journals full of reminders to themselves of lessons they kept forgetting, but they found it. And the path they traced to it, from Zeno on the street corner in Athens, through Epictetus's small school in the north of Greece, through the campaigns and the plague years and the private hours of Marcus Aurelius's reign, through the letters Seneca wrote knowing they might be his last, that path is here tonight, in this room, in this silence, available to anyone willing to follow it far enough. And what stands at the end of it, the thing that all the practices and all the lessons have been clearing the ground for, is not a technique. It is a relationship, a specific, chosen, daily renewed relationship between the self and the actual texture of existence. A relationship in which the night is not an enemy, in which the silence is not a threat, in which the thoughts that arrive are not intruders to be expelled, but material to be seen clearly, located honestly, and then, with genuine trust in the rational order of things, set down. Because what the Stoics ultimately discovered, across 500 years of the tradition from Zeno to Marcus Aurelius, is that the mind looking for rest and the mind looking for wisdom are not two different minds. They are the same mind, at the same threshold asking the same question in two different registers. How do I stop fighting what I cannot change? And the answer that the whole tradition assembled over centuries of practice and failure and recorded insight, is also always the same. You stop fighting it not by winning the fight, and not by giving up the fight. You stop fighting it by understanding, at the level below argument, below technique, below even philosophy as a discipline, that the fight was never necessary, that the thing you were fighting was never actually your enemy, that the night and the silence and the thoughts that arrive in it are not things happening to you. They are things happening with you, and you are not separate from them in the way fear insists you are. You are part of them, part of the same order, part of the same logos that Marcus Aurelius trusted and Epictetus demonstrated and Seneca articulated in the last letters of his life. And knowing that, genuinely knowing it, not as an idea but as something you have built through practice and evidence and honest engagement with the hardest questions the dark can produce, changes what the night is, not into something comfortable, into something real. And real, it turns out, is something the body can rest in, even when comfortable is unavailable. The payoff for all of it, the place where the 500-year tradition arrives at its most practical and most personal application, begins exactly here. The payoff is not a single technique, it is a sequence. And the sequence matters, because each element prepares the conditions that make the next one possible. This is what distinguishes the Stoic approach to nighttime rest from the dozens of sleep advice systems that borrow individual elements without understanding how they relate to each other. The breathing exercise that does not follow the evening review is working against an unprepared mind. The gratitude practice that does not follow the honest accounting of the day is, in the Stoic analysis, a form of bypassing rather than genuine presence. The premeditation of difficult outcomes that is not grounded in the dichotomy of control becomes not medicine but catastrophizing. The individual techniques are real, but their power comes from the order in which they are practiced, and from the philosophical understanding that makes each one something more than a trick. So the sequence, as the Stoic tradition assembled it across centuries of careful observation, begins not in the bedroom, not at the moment you lie down, but earlier in the evening, when the day is genuinely done and before the transition into night has begun. This is the time the Stoics set aside for what Seneca called the settling of accounts, not the metaphor of finance, not the adding up of wins and losses, but the more fundamental accounting. What happened today that I need to be honest about before I release it? The first movement in the settling of accounts is the review of the day from beginning to end, not as a performance review, not as a measure of productivity, but as a factual survey. What happened? Not what should have happened. Not what I wish had happened. Not what I am afraid might be concluded from what happened. What actually happened. The Stoics insisted on this level of factual specificity because the anxious mind, when reviewing a day, almost immediately shifts from facts to interpretations, from what occurred to what it means, from events to verdicts. And the movement from facts to verdicts is where the distortion enters. where the mind begins to carry forward into the night not the day as it was, but the day as anxiety has edited it. So the first discipline is deliberate, maintained factual contact. What was said? What was done? What was not done? Who was present? What changed and what did not? This is the equivalent of Epictetus's objective representation, applied retrospectively to the day just completed. Strip the events of their interpretive overlay. Let them be what they were, no larger and no smaller, no more or less significant than the facts themselves warrant. The second movement in the sequence is the question of control, of everything that the day contained, what was genuinely in your power and what was not. This is not an abstract application of the dichotomy of control. It is a specific, concrete sorting of today's actual events into their actual categories. The conversation that went badly, was the outcome of it in your power? The response you gave, the quality of attention you brought, the honesty of your engagement, those were in your power. The other person's reaction, the conclusion they drew, the decision they made as a result, those were not. If you are carrying tonight the weight of the other person's reaction, you are carrying something that was never yours. This is the moment to return it. Not to dismiss it, not to pretend it does not matter, but to accurately locate it in the category of things that belong to the world rather than to you. This sorting is not always clean. There are genuine areas of ambiguity, situations where your choices and external factors are so intertwined that the line between them is not easily drawn. The Stoics acknowledged this. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the difficulty of distinguishing clearly between what he could and could not have controlled in a given situation, and he returned to it multiple times in the Meditations without always arriving at a definitive answer. The uncertainty is part of the practice. The act of asking the question, honestly and without defensiveness, is itself the practice, regardless of whether the answer arrives with perfect clarity. The third movement is what the Stoics called the acknowledgement of character. Seneca's 3-pass review ends here. Where did I act well? Not where did things go well, which is a different question entirely, but where did I act well? Where was my response proportionate, honest, generous, or courageous, in a way that is worth recognizing and remembering? This is not self-congratulation. It is calibration. The mind that only notices its failures has a distorted map of itself, and navigating by a distorted map produces predictable and compounding errors. Accurate self-knowledge requires honest registration of both the shortfalls and the genuine achievements of the day. After the review is complete, after the accounts have been genuinely settled, a second practice begins that the Stoics understood as preparation rather than action, the deliberate displacement of the day's unresolved material from the interior of the mind to somewhere outside it. Writing, for Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, was the primary method. The act of putting words to what is in your head changes its nature. Words on a page have boundaries. They begin and they end. They cannot combine with other words in the dark the way free-floating thoughts can. They are not gone, but they are contained, and the mind that has written down its concerns has done something functionally significant. It has demonstrated to itself that the concern can be held somewhere other than inside the active mind, which means the active mind does not have to keep holding it. This is the moment that corresponds in physical terms to setting down the bag. The bag is not gone. The concerns it contains are real and they will need to be addressed, some tomorrow, some in the longer arc of a life being lived with attention. But the body carrying the bag can rest, and the body that rests will address tomorrow's concerns with considerably more capability than the body that spent the night carrying the bag. The fourth movement is what the Stoics called the practice of enough. a brief, specific, genuine recognition of what today contained that was worth having. Not a list of things to be grateful for in the abstract, not an exercise in manufactured positivity, but an honest look at the actual texture of the day for the things that were real and good. The quality of light at a particular moment, a conversation that had genuine content, a piece of work that went well, a small kindness given or received. The Stoics were not sentimentalists. They did not inflate this practice with more emotional color than the facts warranted, but they maintained it because they understood something about the relationship between attention and experience that has since been confirmed by research across multiple fields. What you attend to shapes your experience of it, and the day that is attended to honestly, including its genuine goods, is a day that does not need to have been perfect in order to have been worth living. There is a fifth movement, and it is the most counterintuitive of all. Before sleep, the Stoics recommended a brief, calm, deliberate acknowledgement of impermanence, not the anxious thought that everything might be taken away, which is fear wearing the costume of memento mori. The genuine, settled, almost serene acknowledgement that this day is complete and will not come again, that the people encountered in it are mortal, that the circumstances of tomorrow are uncertain, and that all of this is as it should be, because impermanence is not a defect in the structure of existence. It is the structure of existence, and fighting it has never produced anything but exhaustion. Marcus Aurelius closed many days by returning to the image of the view from above, pulling the perspective out until the specific anxieties of the day shrank to their actual size against the immensity of time and the vastness of the cosmos. He was not retreating from the day's concerns. He was restoring their proportion. And proportion in the Stoic framework is both an intellectual achievement and a physical one. The body held in accurate proportion to reality rests differently than the body inflated, with exaggerated significance. These 5 movements, taken together, constitute what the Stoic tradition actually means when it speaks of preparing for sleep. Not a practice of emptying the mind, which is neither possible nor desirable. A practice of honestly finishing the day, giving it what it deserves, which is attention, honesty, and acknowledgement, and then releasing it, which it also deserves, because a day that has received full attention does not need to continue past its natural boundary. The consequences of this practice, when applied with genuine philosophical engagement, rather than as a mechanical checklist, are specific, and they are documented. Across the Stoic texts, across the letters and the journals and the lecture notes, the evidence is consistent. The practitioners who followed the sequence most diligently were not people who stopped having difficult thoughts at night. They were people who stopped being controlled by those thoughts. The thoughts arrived, as thoughts always do, and they were seen clearly and they were located correctly in the landscape of what could and could not be changed, and they were set down. Not suppressed. Set down. And from that setting down, sleep became something that the body could enter with something closer to genuine willingness. The larger consequence, the one that closes the loop opened by the very first question this documentary asked, is not only about sleep. It never was. The question was not, how do you sleep better? The question embedded in every night of sleeplessness, the one that was sitting underneath every circular thought and every anxious rehearsal, is, how do you live with reality as it actually is, rather than as you need it to be? How do you build a life that does not depend on the future being predictable, on the past being erasable, on other people being different from what they are? The Stoic answer, assembled by a former slave and a philosopher emperor and a condemned senator across 5 centuries of a single tradition, is, you build it in the dark, in the specific quiet of the evening, in the honest accounting of the day, in the genuine release of what cannot be carried, in the deliberate cultivation of a mind that knows the difference between what is its responsibility and what is not. You build it not in the heroic moments of visible courage, but in the repeated, private, unwitnessed practice of examining one day and closing it well before beginning the next. Epictetus said that philosophy is not a performance, it is a practice, and the practice has no audience except the practitioner and whatever order underlies all things. It does not produce trophies or recognition or the immediate satisfaction of having solved a problem. What it produces, slowly in the accretion of practiced evenings and rested mornings, is something the Stoics considered more valuable than any of those things, a character that is not at the mercy of circumstances. A self that meets whatever comes with the full weight of its training, rather than with the panicked improvisation of someone who has never asked what is actually in their power. And here is something the texts do not say directly, but that emerges clearly when you read them together in sufficient depth. The three great Stoic voices who carry this tradition, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, had very different temperaments, very different positions in the world, very different daily lives, and very different levels of access to comfort and power and safety. What they shared was the practice. The specific, humble, repeated, imperfect practice of reviewing the day and closing it, of sorting concerns into their correct categories, of releasing what was not theirs to carry, of sleeping in the trust that reality does not require their wakefulness to continue. And they all reported the same consequence. Not that life became easier. Life did not become easier for any of them. Epictetus continued to live in poverty and exile. Marcus Aurelius continued to fight wars and watch the people he loved die. Seneca continued to navigate the lethal politics of a court that would eventually require his death. Life did not become easier. But the relationship to the difficulty changed. The nights changed, not into something effortless, but into something that could be met with presence rather than dread, something that could be used, in the best Stoic tradition, as material for the ongoing project of becoming a person equal to their circumstances, which is, when all the philosophy has been stripped back to its functional core, what all of it was always pointing toward. Not serenity as an end in itself, not calm as a personality type, or a mood or a performance, but the quiet competence of a mind that knows itself well enough to give the night what the night is owed, an honest accounting and a genuine release. And in exchange for that honesty and that release, the night gives back what it alone can offer, the restoration of a mind that can meet tomorrow with something better than exhaustion. The question that remains, the one that has been circling since the beginning and that still has not been fully answered, is about the person for whom the practice breaks down at the deepest level. The person for whom the grief is not rational, the fear is not manageable, the darkness is not a philosophical challenge but an actual weight pressing on an actual chest, in an actual room where nothing the Stoics said feels like it applies. That person, and the specific Stoic response to their specific condition, is where this arrives next. The person for whom the practice breaks down is not a failure of Stoicism. They are the person Stoicism was most carefully designed for. This needs to be said directly, because the most common misreading of the tradition, the one that causes the most harm to people who encounter it at vulnerable moments, is the belief that Stoicism is a philosophy for the strong, that it is a set of tools for people who are basically fine, who have enough of their foundational stability intact to apply rational frameworks to their difficulties. That the person in genuine crisis, the person whose grief is so deep or whose fear is so physical that no philosophical argument can reach it, has somehow fallen outside the scope of what the tradition offers. This was never true. and understanding why it was never true requires returning to the specific circumstances in which the philosophy was actually practiced, not in the lecture hall, not in the comfortable study, but in the conditions that Marcus Aurelius described in the Meditations without euphemism. He described sitting with the death of his son Annius Verus, who died in childhood. He described the sensation of grief that does not respond to his own philosophical arguments. He wrote, in a passage that most anthologies omit because it does not fit the image of the Stoic sage, that sometimes the grief is simply present, and that the practice in those moments is not to argue with it or to resolve it through the dichotomy of control, but to be present with it without adding a second layer of suffering on top of it, without condemning yourself for the grief, without concluding from the grief that the philosophy has failed or that you have failed the philosophy. He wrote something that is, in the full context of the Meditations, one of the most important observations in the entire text. He wrote that it is possible to be moved without being swept away, that the emotion can be genuine and full and present, and that the philosophical practice is not the suppression of it, but the preservation of your capacity to remain yourself inside it, not above it, not outside it, inside it, with enough of the trained self intact to keep the emotion from becoming your entire identity. This distinction matters enormously for the person lying in the dark with grief or fear that the rational practices cannot touch. Because the Stoic response to that situation is not more philosophy. It is the acknowledgement of what is actually happening, that the human capacity for rational self-management has limits, that those limits are real and not shameful, and that the tradition which knows this most clearly is the tradition that trained for it most seriously. Epictetus never claimed that the practice made everything manageable. He claimed that it extended the range of what a person could face without losing themselves. But he acknowledged the range had limits, and the limits were not a problem to be solved. They were part of the human condition to be accepted with the same honesty that the tradition applied to everything else. What the Stoics offered the person at those limits was not a technique, but a kind of company. The company of minds that had been in the same place and had documented it honestly, without performing serenity they did not have. Marcus Aurelius did not pretend to be undisturbed by the death of his children. Seneca did not pretend to be entirely unafraid in the hours before his death. Epictetus did not pretend that the memory of his enslavement left no mark. What they pretended was nothing. They were ruthlessly honest about the difficulty, and from that honesty they derived a form of practical credibility that pure philosophical argument cannot produce on its own. This is the element that changes the broader interpretation of everything that has been said tonight, and it needs to be named clearly before anything else can be closed. The Stoic tradition is not an optimism. It is not a claim that things will work out, that suffering has a purpose, that the universe is organized for human benefit, or that the practices will produce consistent results on any particular schedule. It makes none of those promises. What it offers instead is something more specific and in many ways more useful, a method of honest engagement with reality that reduces the suffering that is caused not by reality itself, but by the ways we relate to reality. The suffering that is caused by false expectations, by the belief that things should be other than they are, by the clinging to outcomes that cannot be guaranteed, by the failure to locate concerns correctly in the landscape of what we can and cannot change. That suffering, the Stoics maintained, is unnecessary. Not all suffering, not the grief of genuine loss, not the fear of actual danger, but the second layer of suffering, the suffering about the suffering, the anxiety about the anxiety, the anguish about the anguish. That is the layer the practice addresses. And that layer, for most people on most nights, is responsible for a very large portion of what keeps them awake. The longer-term consequence of practicing the Stoic approach to night, documented across the texts and corroborated by what we know from the historical records of how these philosophers lived, is not the elimination of difficult nights. It is a change in their frequency and their quality. The nights that cannot be rested through happen less often because the evening practices remove the fuel that feeds the insomnia cascade. The nights that still cannot be rested through are met with a different quality of presence. Not the panicked resistance of a mind that believes the wakefulness is a disaster, but the steadier company of a mind that has been here before, that knows its own responses, that can apply what it has learned without waiting for the distress to fully pass. Seneca described this in his final letters with a precision that is worth dwelling on. He said that the person who has practiced well does not become someone who never struggles. They become someone who struggles more usefully, who brings to the struggle a set of resources that were not available before, the resource of accurate self-knowledge, the resource of practiced honesty, the resource of having sat with difficult thoughts in the dark, and found that sitting with them is survivable and even, in a qualified way, instructive. He also said something that is, in the full context of his life and death, extraordinary. He said that the best preparation for the hardest nights is not to avoid the hard nights, which is not possible, but to have spent the ordinary nights practicing the full sequence of the evening review and the closing of the record, so that when the night that cannot be managed arrives, the habit is already there. The practice does not wait for the crisis. The practice builds the capacity that will meet the crisis when it comes. And here is the final surprising detail, the one that changes something about how all of this sits. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the private journal that contained his most honest struggles and his most rigorous self-examination, was never meant to survive him. He wrote it for himself alone. It was not a philosophical treatise designed for an audience, not a set of teachings intended for students, not a document composed with any expectation of being read after his death. It was, in the most literal sense, a private practice. A man talking to himself in the dark, applying the Stoic method to his own specific failures and fears and griefs, night after night, over what appears to have been many years of private writing. The document survived because someone, almost certainly a member of his household or administration, recognized its value and preserved it after his death in 180 of the Common Era. Had that person not made that choice, the Meditations would not exist. The most intimate record we have of the Stoic practice in action. The document that has shaped how millions of people across 2,000 years have understood the relationship between philosophy and the private mind, very nearly did not make it to us. It survived by the narrowest of margins, through an act of preservation whose details we do not know, by a person whose name we do not have. What that means is this: everything that the Meditations has offered, to everyone who has read it and been changed by it, began with a man who was not trying to offer anything, who was trying only to be honest with himself in the dark, to apply what he had been taught to the actual contents of his own mind, to close the record of each day and release it without performance for an audience that did not exist. The most public consequence of his private practice was not something he planned or pursued. It arrived entirely from outside the practice itself. This changes the interpretation of what the Stoic practice is for. It has always been presented, from Zeno forward, as a practice for the practitioner, for the benefit of the person doing it, in the ordinary moments of their ordinary life, not for legacy, not for recognition, not for the production of wisdom that will outlast the body that generated it. The Stoics were consistent on this point. The practice is its own justification. You do not practice the evening review because it will make you famous, or because posterity will benefit from the record you keep. You practice it because the quality of your own engagement with your own life is worth caring about for its own sake. But Marcus Aurelius, practicing exactly that, produced something that has reached every corner of the world his empire never touched, across 2,000 years of translation and interpretation and application in circumstances he could not have imagined. Not because he was trying to, because he was not, which suggests something about the relationship between genuine private practice and its wider effects that no Stoic argument could have produced as convincingly as this biographical fact. The person who practices well, in private, without audience, without expectation of consequence beyond the improvement of their own mind, produces something that extends outward in ways they cannot predict and may never know. Not always, not reliably, not in a way that makes the outcome into a motivation, but sometimes in ways that are not available to the person who is performing the practice for an audience. The genuine private effort leaves a mark that outlasts everything else. You will not know what marks you leave by practicing honestly in the dark. That is precisely the point. The Stoic practice is not an investment strategy. It is not a path to influence or a method for producing a legacy. It is what it always was, a way of being honest with yourself in the specific quiet of the evening, sorting what is yours from what is not, releasing what cannot be changed, receiving what the day actually offered, and trusting, without guarantee, that the order underlying things does not require your supervision to proceed. And what that practice produces, when it is done with genuine engagement over genuine time, is something that is very difficult to describe without overstating it, but that is consistently documented in the lives of the people who built the tradition, and in the accounts of those who have applied it since. It produces a different quality of night. Not a perfect night, not a night without thought or without feeling, a night in which the thoughts and the feelings are met with something other than fear, a night in which the silence is not an accusation and the dark is not a threat, a night in which the body, having been given permission to release the day, actually releases it, and the morning that follows such a night is different from the morning that follows a night of anxious wakefulness, not only in the obvious ways, in the energy available, in the cognitive function accessible, in the emotional resilience that sleep restores. It is different in a subtler way that the Stoics would have recognized immediately. The person who wakes from a genuinely rested night wakes with the past, in the specific sense of last night's unfinished mental business, behind them rather than still present. They wake, in the Stoic language, free, not free from difficulty, not free from the challenges and griefs and uncertainties that will arrive with the day, but free from the weight of yesterday's review that was never closed, free to meet today with the full capacity of a mind that was allowed to rest. This freedom is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is quiet in the way that all genuine philosophical achievement is quiet, not a transformation visible from outside, but a shift in the texture of the interior life that only the person living it can fully feel. But the Stoics would say that is exactly the right audience. The person living the life is the only audience that has ever mattered for this practice. And tonight, in this specific room, with this specific mind that is learning to close the day and release the weight and trust the darkness, that audience is present and awake and, if the practice has begun to work, very nearly ready for sleep. What remains to be said, the final thread that has been running through everything and that the tradition reserves for the end, is not a technique or a philosophy or an argument. It is a recognition, a simple, human, honest recognition of something the Stoics understood before they had the language for it, and that every person who has ever lain awake in the dark understands from the inside. This is hard. The practice is hard. Closing the day is hard. Trusting the night is hard. Living without the guarantee of the outcomes you need is hard. And the hardness is not something the philosophy removes. It is something the philosophy makes it possible to meet without being diminished by. That is the inheritance Zeno left when he walked out of the bookshop in Athens. That is what Epictetus carried out of slavery. That is what Marcus Aurelius carried through the campaigns and the grief and the plague years. That is what Seneca wrote in his final letters, knowing they might be the last words he would have the opportunity to set down. The hardness is real, and it is bearable, and bearing it well in the specific quiet of the night, with honesty and practice and the company of a tradition that has been here before, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. There is a question that the Stoic tradition never fully resolved, not because the philosophers lacked the intelligence to resolve it, but because it is not the kind of question that admits of resolution. It is the kind that can only be lived with, and lived with better or worse depending on the quality of the engagement you bring to it. The question is, how much of what I am is a choice? Zeno could not choose the shipwreck that sent him to Athens. Epictetus could not choose the family that sold him into slavery or the master who broke his leg. Marcus Aurelius could not choose to be born into a family that would eventually require him to govern an empire. Seneca could not choose the emperor he would serve, or the political climate that would eventually condemn him. The circumstances that shaped each of these men arrived before the philosophy did. The conditions of their lives were not selected from a menu of options. They were imposed in most cases brutally by forces entirely outside the dichotomy of control. And yet each of them, working within those circumstances rather than against them, produced something that 2,000 years of history has not diminished, not triumph in any simple sense, not lives that were comfortable or easy or free from injustice, but lives that were, in a specific and documented way, genuinely lived with full engagement, full honesty, and the recurring courage to examine the interior rather than the exterior when things went wrong. This is the legacy that is actually being handed forward when the Stoic texts are read. Not a set of techniques for emotional management, though the techniques are real and they work. Not a philosophical system to be debated, though the system repays serious intellectual attention. What is being handed forward is the evidence that the interior life can be cultivated, that the quality of the relationship between a person and their own mind is not fixed at birth or determined entirely by circumstance, that it is, within real limits and with real effort, a domain of genuine choice. That evidence is what makes the meditations extraordinary, not the philosophy it contains, which can be found elsewhere in the tradition. The extraordinary thing is that a man at the apex of the ancient world's power structure, a man who could have spent every evening in entertainment or distraction, or the simple pleasure of having survived another day, in a position that was, by any historical measure, almost impossibly demanding, chose instead to sit with a journal and be honest with himself. Chose to identify where he had fallen short and where he had done well and where he had confused the controllable with the uncontrollable and where he had let the day close without the honest accounting it deserved. He chose the practice when the alternative was available and easier, and nobody would have known the difference. And that choice, made privately and without audience, is the choice that the Stoic tradition ultimately comes down to. Not the grand philosophical decision to adopt a way of life, but the small, repeated, private decision to do the work tonight when you could as easily avoid it. What makes this relevant now, in the conditions of a world that Marcus Aurelius could not have imagined, is that the avoidance has never been easier and the cost of it has never been more visible. The technologies designed to fill every gap of silence, to answer every moment of potential discomfort with stimulus, to give the restless mind exactly the kind of external input it reaches for when it wants to avoid its own contents, these are not neutral. They are not simply entertainment. They are, from the Stoic perspective, a systematic removal of the conditions under which the evening practice can happen. The review cannot occur if the review never begins. The record cannot be closed if the record is never opened. The quiet of the night cannot do its philosophical work if the quiet is never permitted to arrive. This is the unresolved tension the tradition leaves with every person who takes it seriously. Because the Stoic answer to the problem of the restless mind requires exactly the conditions that the modern world most consistently prevents: silence, stillness, honest interior attention, and the willingness to stay with what the interior attention reveals, rather than immediately reaching for something that replaces it with noise. The Stoics did not live in a quiet world. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era was loud, crowded, politically volatile, and socially demanding in ways that the historical record makes clear. Marcus Aurelius was not practicing in a monastery. Seneca was not writing from retreat. Epictetus was teaching in a room that had nothing in it. The conditions for the practice were made, not given. The silence was chosen, not inherited. And the choice to make it in circumstances that did not automatically provide it is the choice that the tradition has always been asking. And so, the question that remains, after everything the Stoics built and documented and left behind, is not whether the practices work. They work. The evidence is as clear as 2,000 years of consistent application across radically different cultures and circumstances can make it. The question is simpler than that, and harder. It is whether you will begin tonight, not perfect the practice, not master the philosophy, not achieve the serene imperturbability of the hypothetical Stoic sage, who the tradition itself acknowledged was more of a useful ideal than an actual achievable state. Just begin. Begin the evening review, however incomplete. Close the record, however imperfectly. Ask what was and was not in your power today, even if the answer is only partially clear. Sit, for a few minutes, in the specific silence that the Stoic practice requires, and see what is actually there when you stop filling it. Because what is there is not, as anxiety insists, something to be feared. What is there is the actual contents of your life, the real concerns and the real achievements and the real relationships and the real work. The things that genuinely matter and the things that the day inflated into a significance they do not actually have. The losses that deserve their honest weight, and the worries that are borrowing weight from a future that has not arrived. All of it, when seen clearly in the quiet of the evening practice, is more manageable than the mind running without supervision makes it feel. This is what the Stoics were always pointing toward. Not a destination, not a final state of achieved wisdom, but a quality of daily engagement with the actual texture of existence that makes the ordinary extraordinary, that makes a night in a dark room, with a quiet mind and a body finally at rest, not a suspension of the philosophical life, but its most concentrated expression. Zeno left the bookshop and built a philosophy. Epictetus survived bondage and taught freedom. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire and wrote to himself in the dark. Seneca faced his death and wrote letters about how to live. All of them arrived, by different routes and under different pressures, at the same basic practice. the practice of honest engagement with what is, the release of what cannot be changed, and the trust that what remains, the clear-eyed, rested, philosophically grounded self that emerges from that process is adequate to whatever tomorrow will bring. That self is available to you tonight, not at the end of a long program of study or after years of consistent practice. Available right now in the specific form of the first small choice, to stay with the quiet rather than flee it, to ask the question rather than avoid it, to close the day rather than let it run past midnight. If these lessons have offered something useful, if any thread of what the Stoics built has found its way into the texture of how this night feels, that is enough. That is, in the Stoic language, already a form of progress, and progress is what the prokoptos, the one making their way along the path, actually requires. Not arrival, movement in the right direction, one practiced evening at a time. If you would like to continue this journey, to go deeper into the practices and the philosophy and the specific lessons that the Stoic tradition assembled for the conduct of a life, please subscribe to this channel. There is more here, and it has been made for exactly the person who stayed this long, who listened this carefully, who asked the question and was willing to sit with the answer until the night grew quiet around it. Sleep well. The morning, and everything it will require, can wait until morning.